I never thought I'd be back in this house, sitting on the floor with boxes of old photographs, trying to decide what to keep and what to throw away. It didn't feel real. Greg was gone. The man who had spent most of my life making me feel like I wasn't enough, like I was a burden, dead, just like that. The funeral had been earlier today, a stiff, formal affair that barely felt like it was for the same man I had grown up with. People stood around, talking about what a great man he had been, how much he had cared about his family. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. What family? The one he ignored? The son he barely tolerated? I was 8 when my mom, Laura, married Greg. I don't remember much about my biological dad. He left when I was too young to understand what abandonment really meant, but I do remember how hopeful my mom was when she met Greg. She wanted a fresh start, a stable home. And Greg? He was the kind of man who believed in rules, discipline, and respect. At first, I thought that meant he'd be a real father to me. I was wrong. He never hit me, never yelled. He didn't need to. His disapproval was like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating. Every mistake, every misstep, was met with silence or a quiet remark about how I could do better. It was never enough. Nothing was. If I got an A, he wanted to know why it wasn't an A+. If I cleaned my room, he found something out of place. Even the way I ate dinner was scrutinized. Elbows off the table, sit up straight, don't talk unless spoken to. And then Ethan was born. Everything changed the day Greg held his son for the first time. I remember standing by my mom's hospital bed, watching his face light up in a way I had never seen before. He looked at Ethan like he was the most precious thing in the world. I wanted to believe that having a little brother would bring us all closer, that maybe Greg would finally see me as his own. Instead, it made the gap between us even wider. Ethan was everything I wasn't, Greg's real son, the perfect golden child. He got love, attention, praise. I got expectations. When Ethan took his first steps, Greg clapped and cheered. When I won a school competition, I got a nod and a reminder not to let it go to my head. I tried to be what Greg wanted. For years, I tried. But nothing worked. One birthday, when I was 15, Mom made me a cake and we had a small dinner at home. Greg gave me a card, just a plain, generic card with my name on it. No gift, no real effort. 2 weeks later, Ethan turned 6. Greg rented out an entire arcade for him, invited his whole class, bought him a new bike. I remember sitting in my room that night, staring at the ceiling, realizing that no matter what I did, I would never be Ethan. Mom saw it. She tried to make up for it, always telling me Greg cared in his own way. He just wants you to be strong, she'd say, but I stopped believing it. Strong for what? Life? The world? Or just strong enough to handle never being loved the way Ethan was? As the years passed, I stopped trying. I kept my head down, did what was expected of me, and waited for the day I could leave. I didn't hate Greg, not exactly. I just didn't care anymore. Now, sitting in the house that no longer felt like mine, surrounded by pieces of a life I had never truly belonged to, I couldn't help but wonder if Greg had ever really seen me at all. When my mom got sick, everything shifted. It started slow, just fatigue, small things she brushed off. But before long, the doctors had names for what was happening to her, words that felt too big and too final. Cancer. Stage 4. The kind you don't come back from. Greg handled it the way he handled everything. With quiet, controlled efficiency. He scheduled appointments, arranged treatments, made decisions without asking for input. He never broke down, never wavered. If he was scared, he never showed it. But I saw the cracks in him when he thought no one was looking. The way his hands shook slightly when he adjusted Mom's pillows, the way he lingered in the doorway after tucking her in for the night. Ethan, on the other hand, disappeared. He called sometimes, always with the same excuses. Work is crazy, the kids are sick, I'll come next weekend. But next weekend never came. He had his own life, far removed from ours, and he seemed content to keep it that way. I stayed. I sat by Mom's bed when she couldn't sleep, listened to her whisper about regrets and things she wished she had more time for. I made her tea, read to her when her eyes were too tired to focus. I was the one who held her hand when the pain got too much, who told her it was okay to let go when we both knew she wasn't ready. Ethan wasn't there when she died. He called 2 days later, voice thick with guilt. I should have been there, he said, like it changed anything. I told him about the funeral. He promised to come. He didn't. Greg didn't say much about Ethan's absence, but I could see something had shifted in him. He didn't talk about it, but I caught him staring at the door sometimes, as if expecting Ethan to walk in at any moment. He never did. Without Mom, the house felt like it had lost its center. Greg and I weren't close, and without her to bridge the gap, we barely spoke. Still, I stayed. Maybe out of obligation, maybe because I didn't know what else to do. Greg got older. Slower. He hated admitting he needed help, but the signs were there. He struggled to do things that had once been second nature. Cooking, driving, even walking up the stairs. I stepped in when I could, ran errands, made sure he ate. He never thanked me, never acknowledged it. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where I thought I saw something in his eyes. Maybe gratitude, maybe regret. Ethan remained a ghost in our lives. He called Greg every few months, just enough to convince himself he was doing his duty as a son. But he never visited. Not for the holidays. Not for birthdays. Not once. Then, one night, Greg was gone. A heart attack. Sudden. Quick. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't. I was the one who found him. The funeral was strange. People spoke about Greg like he had been this great, loving father, a man who had dedicated his life to his family. I wondered if they even knew him at all. Ethan showed up, playing the role of the grieving son with ease. He shook hands, nodded solemnly, accepted condolences as if he had earned them. I watched him, waiting to see if he'd say something real. He didn't. After the service, when most of the guests had left, he pulled me aside. For a brief second, I thought maybe, just maybe, he wanted to talk, to acknowledge everything we had lost. But instead he said, "So, about the house." I blinked at him, not understanding. What about it? He sighed like I was being difficult. "I'll need you to move out by the end of the month." The words hit me harder than I expected. "Excuse me?" "The house," he repeated, slower this time, like I was a child. "Dad left it to me." I felt something inside me crack, but I kept my face neutral. "You sure about that?" He scoffed. "Come on, Ryan. You didn't actually think he'd leave it to you, did you?" I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. But there wasn't one. He was serious. And that was the moment I realized it. He had already decided how this was going to go. It didn't matter that I had stayed, that I had taken care of Greg in his final years, while Ethan had been nowhere. None of it mattered. In his mind, Greg had always belonged to him. And so did everything Greg had owned. I wanted to fight him. I wanted to tell him he didn't deserve this house, that he hadn't earned it. But another part of me, the part that had spent my whole life being pushed aside, just felt exhausted. I exhaled slowly, nodding. "Fine. I'll be out by the end of the month." Ethan patted me on the shoulder like he had just done me a favor. "It's nothing personal." And then he walked away, arm around Olivia, their kids running ahead. That night, I started packing, sorting through a lifetime of memories, trying to decide what was worth keeping, what mattered. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if I had anything to show for it. A week after I moved out, I was still struggling to process everything. I stayed with my Aunt Linda for the time being, crashing in her guest room while I tried to figure out my next steps. She didn't push me to talk, which I appreciated. She just let me be. At night, lying awake in a bed that wasn't mine, I kept replaying that moment in my head. Ethan standing there, telling me to leave like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like he had every right to. And maybe, in his mind he did. Greg had always made him feel like he was the only one who mattered. Why would death change that? I tried not to dwell on it, but the bitterness was hard to shake. Especially when I thought about everything I had done for Greg in the last few years. The doctor's appointments, the hospital stays, the late nights spent making sure he was still breathing. The way he had never once said thank you. Ethan hadn't been there for any of it. And yet, he was the one who walked away with everything. One night, as I lay staring at the ceiling, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something made me pick up. "Ryan Carter?" The voice on the other end was professional, clipped. Yeah. My name is David Thompson. I was your stepfather's attorney. I need to speak with you about something important. I sat up. About what? It would be best to discuss this in person. Could you meet me at the house tomorrow? I hesitated. Ethan already made it clear I'm not welcome there. A pause. Then, I think you'll want to hear what I have to say. I didn't know what to make of that, but something in his tone made my stomach twist. The next day, I pulled up to the house, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. I hadn't been back since I left, and seeing it again sent a wave of something uncomfortable through me. Ethan's car was already in the driveway. Of course it was. I stepped inside, and there he was, sitting at the dining table next to Olivia, looking impatient. Thompson was across from them, a stack of documents in front of him. He motioned for me to sit. "Thank you both for coming," he said. "I know this is a difficult time, but we need to discuss Greg's will." Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Let's just get this over with." Thompson adjusted his glasses, flipping through the paperwork. "Right. I'll get straight to it then." He paused, glancing between us. "Greg left everything to Ryan." The words barely registered at first. I blinked at him, sure I had misheard. Ethan, however, reacted immediately. "What?" His chair scraped against the floor as he shot to his feet. "That's not possible." Thompson didn't flinch. "It's all here in the will. Greg left Ryan the house, his savings, all of his possessions." Ethan's face turned red. "No. No way. I'm his real son." He turned to me, eyes blazing. "You did something. You manipulated him." I let out a hollow laugh. "I didn't even know about this." Thompson pulled out an envelope. "Greg also left a letter. I think it will explain his decision." I swallowed hard as he unfolded the paper and began to read. "To my sons, if you're hearing this, then I'm gone. I know my decision will come as a shock, but I ask you to listen. I made mistakes in my life. I expected too much from Ryan and not enough from Ethan. I thought I was preparing Ryan for the world by being hard on him, but all I did was make him feel like he would never be enough. And Ethan, I gave you everything, but I never taught you what really mattered. I failed you both in different ways. But in the end, I realized something. Being a son isn't about blood. It's about actions. Ryan, you stayed. You took care of me when I needed it the most, even when I didn't deserve it. I see now that you are the man I always hoped you'd become. That's why I'm leaving you the house. Not as a punishment to Ethan, but as a recognition of the person who stood by me when it mattered. I hope one day you both understand, and I hope you can forgive me." Silence filled the room. My chest felt tight. My hands clenched into fists. All these years, I had convinced myself Greg never saw me, that he had never cared. But he had. In his own flawed way, he had. Ethan stood there, frozen. Then, without a word, he grabbed Olivia's hand, turned, and stormed out. A moment later, his car roared to life, tires screeching as he sped away. Thompson exhaled and turned to me. "I know this is a lot to take in." I nodded numbly. "Yeah, it is. There's one more thing." He slid an envelope across the table. "Greg left you a personal letter. You can read it in private." I stared at my name written in Greg's sharp, familiar handwriting. My hands shook slightly as I picked it up. I had waited my whole life to hear what was inside. I sat alone in the house for a long time after Thompson left, staring at the envelope with my name on it. I traced the edges with my thumb, my mind racing. This was it. Greg's last words to me. No cold stares, no nods of approval or disappointed sighs. Just his thoughts, written down, waiting to be read. I wasn't sure I was ready. But after everything, I couldn't just walk away. My fingers felt stiff as I unfolded the letter. "Ryan, I know I was never good at saying the things that mattered. I'm not sure I even knew how. But if you're reading this, I want you to know the things I never said when I had the chance. I was hard on you because I thought that was the way to prepare you for life. I thought pushing you would make you stronger, that withholding praise would make you work harder. But now, looking back, I see it for what it was, fear. I was afraid of raising a son who wasn't ready for the world, and in trying to protect you, I made you feel like you weren't enough. That was never true. You were always enough. You were the son who stayed. The son who showed up. The son who did the right thing even when it wasn't asked of him. I saw that. I just never told you. Ethan, I failed him in a different way. I gave him everything but never taught him how to appreciate it. I wanted him to have the life I didn't, but I never made him work for it. Maybe that's why he walked away so easily. Maybe that's why he couldn't be here when it mattered. I hope you won't carry anger toward him. He is who he is because of me. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope this letter gives you some peace. The house is yours because it was always yours. Not because I'm trying to make up for the past, but because you earned it. I am proud of you. Greg. I read the letter 3 times, my vision blurring by the end. For years, I had convinced myself that Greg never cared, that I was nothing more than an obligation to him. Now, holding his words in my hands, I wasn't sure what to do with the truth. I sat back, exhaling slowly. The house was mine. Greg had seen me. He had known. But it didn't erase the years of silence, the moments when I had needed to hear these things from him and never did. I wasn't sure if I could forgive him, but for the first time in my life, I understood him. I spent the next few days going through the house, deciding what to keep and what to let go. Some things were easy, Greg's old suits, his endless collection of paperwork, the books he never let anyone touch. Other things felt heavier. His watch, which he had worn every day until his hands started shaking too much to fasten the strap. His coffee mug, the one he used so much that the handle had worn smooth. And then there were the family photos. I found one in particular that stopped me in my tracks. It was from years ago. Ethan and I as kids, sitting on the porch. I was maybe 10, Ethan barely 3. He was leaning against me, his chubby hands gripping my arm, looking up at me like I was the most important person in the world. I had forgotten that version of him, before Greg turned him into someone else. I didn't know if Ethan would ever come back. I didn't know if we would ever fix what was broken between us. But looking at that picture, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, once, before everything got complicated, he had needed me just as much as I had needed him. And maybe, in some way, he still did. I stayed in the house. At first, it felt wrong, like I was living in someone else's space, waiting for Greg to walk through the door and remind me that I didn't belong. But the days passed, and slowly, the weight of his presence started to fade. I didn't hear from Ethan. Not that I expected to. The way he stormed out, I figured he was either planning to contest the will or pretending I didn't exist. Probably both. And honestly, I didn't care. Or at least, that's what I told myself. But at night, when the house was quiet, I found myself wondering where he was, what he was thinking, if he was angry or just hurt, if he even knew the difference. I spent the next week sorting through what Greg left behind. It was a slow, strange process, going through the life of a man I had never truly known. I found things that surprised me, a drawer full of letters from my mom, all tied together with a ribbon, as if he had read them over and over again. A dusty box of old baseball cards, the same ones I had asked about as a kid, only to be told they weren't for playing. And then there was the will itself. I had asked Thompson for a copy, and when I finally sat down to read it, I realized just how thorough Greg had been. It wasn't just the house. He had left me everything. His savings, his investments. He had even made sure the utilities were covered for the next 6 months, as if he had known I wouldn't be ready to deal with it all right away. There was nothing for Ethan. Not a dollar, not a sentimental item, not even a note in the legal documents. Just the letter Thompson had read aloud. I wondered if Greg had hesitated before making that decision. If he had considered leaving Ethan something, anything, but chose not to. Or maybe, in his mind, this was one final lesson. The one he should have taught years ago. That thought didn't sit right with me. I wasn't sure why I did it, but a few nights later, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand. Ethan's number pulled up on the screen. I stared at it for a long time, debating whether or not to call. He should have been the one reaching out to me. He was the one who left, the one who treated me like an afterthought for years. If anyone owed someone an apology, it was him. But still, I sighed, running a hand through my hair, and finally hit call. It rang, and rang, and rang. Just as I was about to hang up, he answered. Silence. A heavy, weighted silence. Then, finally, what do you want? His voice was rough, tired. Not angry, Just exhausted. I hesitated. We need to talk. A dry laugh. Do we? I clenched my jaw. Greg didn't leave you anything. Yeah, I got that part. He could have, I said. But he didn't. Ethan was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. I thought he would, you know? I thought, he exhaled sharply. Doesn't matter. It does, I said before I could stop myself. If it didn't, you wouldn't have picked up. More silence. Then, I don't know what you want from me, Ryan. I didn't know either. Not really. But for the first time in years, I felt like maybe he didn't either. And maybe that was enough. Ethan didn't hang up. He didn't say anything, either. Just breathing on the other end of the line, like he was waiting for me to say something that would make this easier. But nothing about this was easy. I don't want the house, I said finally. That got his attention. What? I don't want the house, I repeated. But I'm not giving it to you either. He let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Right. So what? You gonna sell it? Cash out and walk away? Maybe, I said. Or maybe I'll do something that actually matters with it. He scoffed. Like what? I don't know yet. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. But Greg left it to me for a reason. And if I learned anything from him, it's that you don't get something for nothing. Silence. Then, softer. You think I don't know that? I hesitated. I don't think you ever had to learn it. Another pause. Longer this time. When Ethan spoke again, his voice was different. Less defensive. I should have been there for Mom. I closed my eyes. Yeah, you should have. He sighed, and for the first time in years, he sounded like my brother. Not the entitled version of him. Not the one who had spent his life expecting things to be handed to him. Just Ethan. The kid who used to follow me around the backyard. Who used to look up to me before Greg turned us into something else. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted. Neither did I. But maybe that was the point. Maybe fixing it wasn't the answer. Maybe we just had to start over. I'll figure out what to do with the house, I said. You figure out what the hell you want from your life. He exhaled, long and slow. Yeah, okay. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like enough.